We've seen in recent weeks how suddenly world events can change and cause such turmoil in the world. And we've seen how the best laid plans of the rulers of this world can go very wrong. I don't think that Vladimir Putin was necessarily expecting things to go as they have in his invasion of Ukraine, unless he's got some extremely secret plan up his sleeve. And we know that the reason for this is that no human ruler is in control of these events. It's God who is the real ruler of the world, who directs them. And this chapter then, tonight, which we're going to look at, is key in showing just how active and in control God is in world affairs, giving us such precise details. In fact, in Daniel 11 we have what might be one of the most detailed prophecies in all Scripture, detailed in the precision of events it describes and how perfectly it correlates with the events of history, as we'll see. So Daniel 11 is one of great detail, but we also find that it includes many of the same points and references which have been mentioned already in the previous prophetic chapters. So we just want to think about why we have this repetition and why so much detail on this occasion. And we could suggest perhaps this is because of the design of the divine mind which inspired this prophecy. It's typical, isn't it, of God's great mercy that he's giving us another opportunity to look into and understand the events which have and will happen on the earth. You know, it's sort of, if you didn't get it the first time, here it is again and again and again, each time showing more and more detail. And we can think of this prophecy as almost being a zoom in on a prophecy which has already been stated. We had Daniel 2, the big picture of events, Nebuchadnezzar's image. Daniel 7, we get further detail about that big image. Daniel 8, it becomes even clearer. In Daniel 11, we get perhaps the most precise details. And so this repeating prophecy is being built up further and further. And one reason for the great detail, which we've already established, is to show how closely God is in control of the events from the time Daniel was writing until now. And we're reminded of this, aren't we, of the constant use of this term throughout the chapter. Yet the end shall be for an appointed time. If you just want to glance over verse 27, it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Verse 29, again we have mention of the appointed time. Verse 35, it is yet for an appointed time, or a time appointed. Again, reminding us that God is preventing certain things from happening because they must all follow a deliberate sequence of events leading to the end. And it shows us God's great power in directing the events of history, but also his great mercy. Mercy in that he's extending the time for others to be given a chance to come to an understanding of his word and have a place in his kingdom. Well, the final reason we have this repeat is because it's now going into more detail, into more depth about events directly impacting Israel. It's all centred around Israel. We've mentioned before how other parts of the scripture of Daniel so far are written in Chaldean, but this now is focused on the Jewish people and in their language, so it's intended for them. It's built around their perception of the world. And that can be seen in the terms used throughout the chapter. There's 3 terms that I want us to define, which will be extremely useful for us before we go on, and we can prove these things later on, but for the time being I'm just going to state them. So 3 principal terms that I'm thinking of. 1, we have the King of the South. King of the South being a foreign power controlling the territory to the south of Israel. Remember, it's all defined around Israel's view of the world, primarily Egypt. King of the North, a foreign power controlling territory to the north of Israel, mainly territory around Syria, Iraq, into modern-day Iran, and also parts of Turkey, modern-day Turkey. And then there's the King, a foreign power controlling all the territories to the north and south of Israel. And we could even add this suggestion of reigning from Constantinople. We'll go into detail about that later. So from this we can see that the prophecy is all centred around then the destiny of Israel, their perspective, their north and their south, not our north, not our south. So let's start then looking at the prophecy. We can sort of divide it into different chronological time periods, and these time periods relate to the powers which were dominant in the region around Israel at the time. So again, it's all from Israel's perspective, from their experience. We start out with the Persian period initially, and that's when Daniel is sort of writing. But from this sort of turning point, 334 onwards, we see the rise of Alexander's kingdom, the Greek successor states. And the Greek period is the main section of the text, from sort of verses 5 to almost 32. So it's a chapter very much concerned with this Greek dominance over the Middle East, over Israel in particular, and the effects that the Greeks had on the Jewish nation. And it's interesting that this main section then sort of covers this period which we don't know that much about in Scripture, the sort of intertestamental period between the end of the prophets, the New Testament. And we know why we don't get much information about it. We can perhaps remind ourselves, if you want to turn to Amos 8 verse 11, don't feel you need to, but in Amos 8 verse 11, we sort of read this point, "Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will send a famine in the land, not a famine of bread, nor a thirst for water, but of hearing the words of the Lord. And they shall wander from sea to sea, and from the north even to the east. They shall run to and fro to seek the word of the Lord, and shall not find it." So there's this sure indication that there would be this period where there wouldn't be sort of divine revelation from God. There would be no word from God during that period. But this chapter then shines a bit of light on what's going on during that period, and that's maybe why we have this extra detail in this chapter. And it's what's going on in the period from the perspective of God. And it again shows us that even during a period when we might think that God is not active and that there's no word, that he's still intensely active. He's still doing things in the world. He's still causing kings to rise and fall, nations to fight each other, and to lead to his plan being fulfilled. He's still intensely active, as he surely is today as well, even though we are not having sort of divine revelation today. But we can see, using the word of God, the things which are happening, we can see that he is active. So after this very long Greek period, which is dealt with by Daniel 11 mainly, there's this sort of short-lived period of Jewish independence, a very sort of brief period. The Jews have been quite unlucky in having independent periods, and now they're actually having a quite long period of independence, but we'll see how long that will last for. So there's the rule of the Maccabees, the Hasmonean dynasty, and then after that we see the sort of rise and the ultimate control, the hegemony of Rome over the whole region from sort of the beginning of the sort of end of the 1st century BC. And finally we jump towards what in this chapter is termed the time of the end, and you'll note that we put 1917, and we'll consider why that might be later. We want to try and explain that. So let's just be looking now at the first verses, the opening verses. We see that the prophecy is given in the first year of Darius, the Medes' reign over Babylon, and we know from Daniel 10 that this was also during the reign of Cyrus, the two being co-regents, we would suggest. And we're told that after this, there are going to be 3 kings of Persia who would arise, and the fourth's going to be greater in wealth. Let's just read that. So it's sort of from verse 2. "Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia." And if we look in history, we can see that 3 kings came after Cyrus, the time that Daniel was writing. Cambyses, Bardiya, Darius, they each increased the power, the strength of the Persian Empire. And by the time of the 4th king, Xerxes, who's mentioned, the empire had great wealth. It was ruling over most of today's modern Middle East, Persia itself, Egypt, Turkey, even going into parts of India we hear about. And we read then that it's by his strength through riches that he stirs up all against Grecia. And Xerxes would go on to do this. He wanted to get revenge for his father Darius' defeat by the Greeks. He tried to subdue them, he'd been unsuccessful. The Greeks were this sort of thorn in the side of sort of Persia's supremacy. And he would rise this great army up, millions if we're to believe some of the numbers that we're given, to finally sort of pacify, to subdue the Greeks. And Xerxes, this 4th king, he would have some significant victories, but he wouldn't fully subdue the Greeks. And of course we have that reference here, don't we, to Daniel 8, where we read about the ram representing Persia, pushing towards the west, north, southward. And we read then that after that another power arises. If we just read on to verse 3, a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And we can identify who this is from verse 4. We read that after he stands up, his kingdom's divided into 4 powers. This has to be referring, doesn't it, to Alexander the Great and the Greek or Macedonian empire that he led. And we know that this kingdom was divided between his 4 generals when he died. And you can see that image in, the goat power from chapter 8. So Alexander, this mighty king, he would indeed stand up. Alexander would attack the Persians. He'd fight them at these great battles, including Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela. And interestingly, these battles were all fought at rivers, every one of them. And we can note that the goat and the ram, if we go back to chapter 8, they're shown as clashing by a river, a vision which obviously represents the same events. And so Alexander, as we can see from the map, which is working, I believe, Alexander would go on to conquer the entire Persian Empire, replacing it with a Greek one in its place. It was an incredible victory, a whirlwind of victories that he led. But he'd die, wouldn't he, very young. His succession would not be smooth. All his family, who would be his natural successors, they were either killed, many were too young, many were incompetent or even incapacitated. And we read that the kingdom in verse 4, if you look, would not go to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. And instead it would be scattered, wouldn't it, between different people. And so into that vacuum, a number of very ambitious generals, people who had been raised with Alexander, who had similar ambitions to him, they'd rise up and take their own portions of the empire. And we can see that division here. And this wasn't a simple drawing up of the map. It wasn't some gentlemanly agreement. We could think of Britain and France, who sort of drew straight lines on a map. If you look at the map of Africa today, or even parts of the Middle East, you just see these sort of direct ruler lines going through all different tribes and countries, without really any regard to the influence it would have and the impact. But this was actually a very messy division. There was a lot of battles in these wars for succession, so it was not a smooth succession in any way. But eventually it would be agreed upon. Eventually there would be a division. And the generals then would be these 4 generals. There would be Ptolemy, who would reign over the territory centred around Egypt. There'd be Seleucus over Persia, and Syria into Babylon, parts of modern Turkey, so a pretty large section. Cassander, Greece, and Lysimachus over Thrace. And so that brings us then onto the main section of the chapter. The main section deals with these different wars between the king of the north and the king of the south. King of the south, of course, referring to the areas around Egypt, the empire of Ptolemy, and then also Seleucus being the king of the north. So king of the south, empire of Ptolemy, king of the north, Seleucus. This doesn't just refer, though, this term king of the north and south, to these 2 people, but also the people who would succeed them, the dynasties they founded, and also will refer to some powers who would succeed them in the future, which we'll come back to. So why does Daniel use these terms north and south? As we've said, there's a pretty obvious reason, which is that one is to the north of Israel, one is to the south of Israel. But there's a bit more to it than that. We see it's the king of the north, the king of the south. They're not just saying Egypt, they're not just saying Syria. And what that describes to us is that it's not some indigenous power. It's not the people of Egypt who are ruling Egypt. It's not the people of Syria who are ruling Syria. This is a foreign, an exogenous power which is ruling the territory. Hence the emphasis on the king, the ruler, who is above the north and the south, who is controlling it. And in the future there will be other foreign powers ruling over these territories, north and south of Israel, and will therefore resume control over these titles. Again, we'll think about that later. Let's go back then to the section. A question we're probably wondering is, which power is more great? Which power is the strongest of the 2? The king of the south, we're told, was strong, but it would be succeeded in greatness by one of his princes, Seleucus, who would be the northern king. And if you read in verse 5, we see he'll be strong above the king of the south with a great dominion. And it's certainly true that the territory he reigned was the part of the world which had greater influence and power. Egypt was not the power it once was in its glory days. Power had shifted since then, hadn't it, towards the north. And so the north was in a strengthened position. Now, these hostilities which had been developing between them in their clash to seize the parts of Alexander's empire would be briefly healed, and they'd be healed by a marriage alliance which we get a description of. And we're told that in the end of the years they shall join themselves together, meaning the two kingdoms. For the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. And obviously that's a marriage agreement. And it's exactly what happened. A marriage union was created to ally the two states, north and south, together, to join themselves together. We used to sort of marriage alliances, aren't we, from the medieval times, if we read about the rulers of England, obviously, and all their alliances with the different medieval dynasties across Europe. And so Antiochus Theos, the northern king, he would divorce his wife, he would marry Bernice, the daughter of Ptolemy Philadelphus, who would be the southern king, to cement this peace, this alliance between the two nations. But we read that this would not last. It would not be a successful alliance. We see, she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in those times. Now, what would happen is that Antiochus would end this marriage with Bernice. We can imagine that often happens with any sort of political alliance. There's not a great deal of genuine sort of love and things that are holding together the marriage. And so he would actually divorce Bernice, and he would re-establish his previous wife to the previous power, Laodice. And in this incredible set of events afterwards, I won't go into too much detail, there's all this political intrigue, and it ends up with Laodice killing her husband, the king. So the northern king is killed. Potentially this is a rumour at least. And then Bernice would be killed, and her successor as well. So the sort of daughter of the king of the south would be killed by people in power in the north, and they would seek to take revenge on it. In particular, her brother, Ptolemy, he would come up and he would seek revenge against her. In verse 7 we see, a branch of her root shall stand up in his estate. He shall come with an army. He shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north. He shall deal against them and shall prevail. So this marriage split-up has also caused a split-up between the north and south. There's a war between the two. And we read that the south is victorious in this war. They succeed. And we see that Ptolemy would come up. He would carry captives into Egypt, their gods with their princes and their precious vessels of silver and gold. And so this action then would put the southern kingdom into the ascendancy. The south is now rising from its initially more junior position. So all these brutal wars between the north and the south continue, and we can read in verse 10 and 11 how the north comes back, tries to fight back. But in verse 14, I just want us to have a look specifically there, that we see that there's a sign of a new power. A new power is beginning to rise in the region. And this is the power of Rome. At that point, Rome was still confined largely to the western Mediterranean. It was held at arm's length by Israel, so they weren't under so much threat from Rome as they would be in the future. Rome was still this Western republic. It wasn't the great empire that it ultimately would be, so it's not quite at the point of Augustus yet, but it's a republic which is coming into view. It was starting to elbow its way into the affairs of the eastern Mediterranean, including the territory of the king of the north and the king of the south. And we're told then about the robbers of thy people. In verse 14, thy people must mean the Jews, mustn't it? That is God's people. And we can identify this as Rome because to describe them as robbers of thy people is a very accurate description of Rome. Rome would go on to completely destroy the Jewish nation, destroying its temple, its riches, scattering its people into a 2,000-year exile, truly robbing God's people of their wealth, their land, their hope. And we read that these robbers would also exalt themselves to establish the vision, again in verse 14, meaning that they will fulfill their role in Daniel's visions to weaken, to scatter the Jewish nation, to become a great power, but that they, as we see at the end of verse 14, will fall. The Roman Empire would ultimately fall, wouldn't it? And its successor states, seen in modern Europe and the Roman Catholic Church, they will also fall at Christ's return. Every last vestige of Rome will be destroyed, especially when Christ comes again. We also identify them as Roman, as we'll come on to later, because they ally with the king of the south. They were allied with them in history. They were allied with Ptolemy's kingdom. Another reference we get of Rome is slightly later in the chapter. We read about the ships of Kittim. That was roughly where we started our reading, wasn't it? Now, in that exact context, we understand that to be a Roman delegation, which was headed from Kittim. Today, we'd identify that with Cyprus. But interestingly, the term Kittim was also used by many Jews after the Romans had taken over Judea to describe the Romans. So Kittim is very much this term which is used to identify Rome at the time. And I'll come back to that maybe in the discussion if we have any time. And we'll also see a bit more of them later in the chapter. The Romans will take on this more serious title, the king. More of that later. But let's return to the clash now between the north and south, and we'll keep an eye on the Romans. So the southern kingdom would be significantly weakened by a new leader. In verse 14, we would have read that in those times there shall stand up against the king of the south many will stand up and oppose the king of the south, who is in this sort of more superior position as we discussed. And what happened at this time was that they came to be led by an infant king, a very young ruler. And we know that infant kings are often very weak. They can't reign very effectively, and they need support, don't they, from people. They have no power to actually do anything themselves. They need to be guarded by someone. They need a guardian or a protector. And so others will seek to usurp the throne. Foreign powers often will come against that country to try and take the power from them. And that was certainly true of that period. Many would indeed stand up against the king of the south. And one foreign power would use that opportunity, and no guesses to find out who it would be the king of the north, would use this opportunity to come against the king of the south. They now have a weak infant ruler with a very unstable government. And so Antiochus III, known to history as Antiochus the Great, he would turn the table significantly on the southern kingdom. He'd defeat them, and he would seize control of Israel. And so you can see his territory expands from the light blue to the darker blue, taking the territory of Israel, bringing it into the northern sphere. And we can see that in verse 15 and 16. The king of the north will come. The arms of the south shall not withstand. He shall stand in the glorious land, verse 16, which must mean Israel. By his hand it will be consumed. And he then press on to attack the rest of the southern kingdom, supported actually by many Jewish people. You'll see in verse 17, it says, he sets his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he'd do so with the upright ones with him, which we understand to mean the Jewish people, the Israelites. And if we're to take Josephus' account into mind, if we're to take that account truthfully, he says that many of the Jews of their own accord went over to him. So the Jews are active, they're taking sides in this battle. And so finally the Seleucid kingdom, the northern kingdom, will be in control of Israel. But instead of continuing to push further into Egypt, because we see his territory doesn't expand into Egypt yet, the north is not yet pushing down all the way into the southern kingdom, instead he turns back. He turns his face to the Isles in verse 18 and concentrates elsewhere. He concentrates on Greece. He has this battle against the Greeks, and he gets defeated in this terrible battle. The Romans actually push him back, and we read that he turns his face to the fort of his own land. So the north, they've done quite well in pushing back, but now they've been sort of a bit humiliated by their most recent campaign in Greece. And so now we come, and I know we're going through it fast, but now we come to verse 21. And this introduces us to a turning point in Jewish history, one which will have a profound effect on the Jewish people, the status of the Jewish nation. And we read here of the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes, who we've heard about in previous chapters. And he would come into power peaceably, we read. He'd obtained the kingdom by flatteries, and it's true, he ensured a quite peaceful succession. And he made great promises to restore the power of the northern kingdom. It had been weakened by its war with Greece, even though it picked up quite a bit in the south. And he said, we need to have another great invasion, a great invasion of the south. And he would do that. He would achieve those things he set out to do. He would succeed in a number of great battles against the south. But when he reached Egypt, when he got all the way to Egypt, he gets turned back. And he gets turned back by what power? We see it's the ships of Kittim. It's that Roman power again, starting to exert its influence in the region. We've talked about how Kittim is this term we use for Rome. And Rome here then is acting as the protector of the south. It allied itself with the southern kingdom against the north. And there's this sort of great tale, if you see the image on the right, there's this great story of what happened when Antiochus reached Egypt when he was going into Alexandria, a key city of the southern kingdom. He was met by a Roman ambassador, someone representing the Roman Republic, and he said, if you go any further than you've come, then Rome will declare war on you, and there'll be a war against you. And he actually put a line in the sand where this phrase perhaps comes from, and he said, if you don't make a decision, if you make a decision now, then either we will attack you, or we can go in peace. And he said, make the decision, either leave Egypt, go back to your own country, go back to your own kingdom, or it will be war with Rome. And so Antiochus, perhaps quite wisely, seeing the great power, the rising power of Rome, decided now would be a time to go back, not to push any further, not to push against Rome. A war with Rome would not have been good at this point, especially with it being a rising power in the region. And so he withdrew. And Antiochus was frustrated by this limit on his advance. And unfortunately for the Jewish people, he would take out much of his anger on them, something which has become a common theme, hasn't it, in Jewish history, Jews being scapegoats for defeat and failure. And he was particularly frustrated as well by the sort of continuing stubborn refusal of many of the Jews to assimilate to Greek culture, to be Hellenized, as we call it. And we read that returning up from Egypt, he takes out anger on the promised land and its people. We see that he has sort of indignation against the Holy Covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant. And he, we read, pollutes the sanctuary of strength. He shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination which maketh desolate. And so Antiochus would commence this very brutal and unprecedented attack on the Jewish people and on their culture, seeking to compel them to worship Greek gods. He would ban the Torah. He would insist on the worship of himself and his various amount of gods. Even setting up the worship of pagan gods in the temple, that was the ultimate insult to the religious Jews of the land. And he'd sacrifice in the temple to his own gods. There's all these famous stories of his sacrifices, of dedicating the temple to various gods, and banning the true worship and the sacrifice of the Jews. And so there'd be this great reaction. There would be a counterforce to what he was doing, and that's from that force that we can see at the bottom, the Maccabees meaning hammers, because of their great strength in battle. And this was an Orthodox Jewish family, initially led by Matthias, and then his sons who succeeded him. And they would fight against the Seleucids. They would fight against the king of the north to retain their independence, to create an independent Jewish state, and actually to bring back true worship to Israel. And they were all sort of rural people around rural territories mainly, in the very Hellenized, very much adopting Greek culture, and stopping the sort of old traditions, particularly the traditions which were worshipped and followed by the people in the rural areas. And you often see that, don't you, that the rural areas are more traditional and the cities are more sort of liberal and open. And they fought this incredible guerrilla war, the Maccabees, against the Greeks, against the Seleucids, and they managed to succeed, despite being perhaps a weaker, perhaps being a smaller force. You can see so many examples of that, can't you, throughout history? Think of Afghanistan recently, where they were able to defeat the United States. You think of the Ukrainians right now, who are managing to win well, not quite win, but at least causing Russia some trouble in winning. And certainly if Russia were to win, I'm sure the Ukrainians would manage to perhaps cause quite a nuisance to them over time. And so there's a long history of sort of small, weaker groups of people being able to defeat larger nations. And certainly the Maccabees were able to do that very effectively. And, we read about them in verse 33 to 35. They that understand, they that know the law, they that adhere to it, they shall instruct many. But initially they wouldn't be successful. Many of them would fall by the sword, by flame, by captivity, and spoil many days. But we read that when they fall, they shall be holpen with a little help. Many shall cleave to them with flatterers. And so they would ultimately succeed. They would create this independent state, an independent Jewish kingdom. Let's move on now to verse 36. So in verse 36, a new character suddenly appears on the world stage, introduced for us. And we no longer have the king of the south. We don't have the king of the north. Now we only have the king. And the king then must be one who rules the entire territory surrounding Israel to north and south, there no longer being any distinction. And of course, the main power that would succeed the Greek, Seleucid and Ptolemaic kingdoms was Rome. And the Maccabean Jewish kingdom itself would be slowly destroyed. It would be turned into a Roman province. And so Rome then was this ruling power now to the north and south of Israel, truly the king. And if we read further, we can see that the king is also talking about Rome from a particular time period. This is a Rome which in verse 37 will not regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. And this must ultimately be referring to what Rome would go on to be, the one established by Constantine, a Rome which no longer acknowledged the pagan gods of its forefathers. And it must ultimately be referring to Roman Christianity, and in that sense, the Roman Catholic Church ultimately. And we see that the king will instead honour a God whom his fathers knew not, that being the new Trinitarian God of Christian Rome. And we see further characteristics of this new Christian Rome, as we hear the king will honour this God with gold, with silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. And we can think, can't we, of the great palaces, temples and cathedrals associated with Roman Christianity and obviously the Roman Catholic Church today. And we see that many of these things, many of these descriptions that we see on the board here, are descriptions which are very similar to 2 Thessalonians 2, where we hear about the Roman Pope, and we hear about the Roman Church and its great power and how it would exalt itself over everything, and it would exalt itself over God, with the Pope declaring that only he had authority and power over the world. And so we see all these additional things, these additional descriptions about him. There's this strange God, a God which the Roman world didn't know about, this Trinitarian God. It would magnify itself above everything. We know the church leaders were kind of seen as God on earth, again referring to 2 Thessalonians 2. Speaks against God, oppressed the true believers throughout the centuries. It rejected the God of Israel. It exalts itself. Rome was a world power, and even afterwards had gone on to be powerful and have influence in world affairs in its different incarnations. Divide the land for gain. That's an interesting description. The Roman Church would generate great wealth through this diocese system where it split up the different territories of the world and take tax from it and take wealth from those territories. And so, if the king then is referring to the Rome defined by Constantine, we should note that Constantine established Constantinople, didn't he, as the centre of this new Christian empire, putting the centre of the king's empire there. And in time, the western half of the empire would fall, leaving the eastern half of its capital still centred in Constantinople. And this empire would be known in history as the Byzantine Empire, wouldn't it? And the empire would grow weaker and weaker under constant attack from the growing power of Islam from the 7th century until in 1453, key date to remember, it would be completely destroyed with the capture of Constantinople by the Muslim Turks. And they would establish the Ottoman Empire in its place, wouldn't they? And so we don't see the end of the king here. This isn't the point at which the king ends. As we've said, the king, is a power, a foreign power ruling the north and south of Israel. And that's what we see, isn't it, with the Ottomans? They were ruling the power, the territory north and south of Israel. And so they would take over this territory and control it. And also they would keep their capital, wouldn't they, in Constantinople. They would rename it in time. Suddenly then we get this huge jump, we get this leap. If we go to verse 40, we suddenly find ourselves in the time of the end, and it might seem quite strange. The last point we were was 1453, maybe even just the rise of Rome, and now there's this massive leap to the time of the end. So how do we relate to this? Well, one thing that we see is that the old kings of the north and the south reappear. There's no longer the king really referenced. We get the king of the south back, and the first to reappear is the king of the south. And the king of the south reappeared when Egypt was once again ruled by a foreign power. That's how we've defined the king of the south, isn't it? A foreign power ruling the territory to the south of Israel, centred in Egypt. And in 1882, Britain would take over Egypt. Britain was at the apogee of its imperial power. It was hoping to build this great territory from sort of South Africa all the way up to Egypt. And they also wanted to gain control over the Suez Canal, all these other territories, which would help Britain cement its control over global trade and sea passages. And so Britain would take over Egypt at this time. And so in effect then, Britain would become the king of the south. And so with the king of the south re-established as Britain, we hear subsequently that the king of the south would push against him. So who is him? The him here must not yet be referring perhaps to the king of the north, as we mentioned in the next verse, but rather the king who has just been mentioned. And so the king of the south is going to push against the king, and the king we've referred to as being the Ottoman Empire, who would inherit that territory and that title of Rome, because it was the power ruling the north and south. And so Britain attacked the Ottoman Empire, didn't it, and took Palestine in 1917. We've got the famous image of Allenby walking into Jerusalem there. And so the king of the south, Britain, pushes at him, the Ottomans. And we know that they did that with a great deal of help from the Arabs. We know the famous story of Lawrence of Arabia, taking over much of the Middle East, but crucially Palestine. And that's really as far as we go in history to our present for Daniel 11. But there's one more thing set to happen, and it must happen, mustn't it, in the relatively near future, if we have indeed entered the time of the end. It can't be too far away if we are in the end times. And so we read what happens next. The king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries, and shall overflow and pass over. What's this talking about? Note that the king of the north isn't pushing, perhaps against the king of the south as we would first think. Britain has left Egypt since then, and Egypt's in fact mentioned as an independent state just a few verses later. And what we actually see is the king of the north coming against him, the him which we've just identified as being the king, or the Ottoman Empire ruling from Constantinople. Now, while the Ottoman Empire no longer exists, it's no longer in existence, and we don't expect to see its revival anytime soon, even if that's what the Turkish president would like, Erdogan. Turkey still exists as that successor of the Ottoman Empire. It's centred in Constantinople. And so the king of the north is attacking Turkey. But who is king of the north? We don't have a revival of the Seleucid Empire, and there's no other foreign power currently occupying those northern states of the Middle East. They are to an extent, independent. Of course, we argue it to be Russia. That's something we all know. But our justification for the King of the North being Russia doesn't just come from the fact that Russia's in the north, and therefore it just sort of seems right, it's just a kind of feeling. Instead, we say that Russia is the King of the North for the fact that from Ezekiel 38, we can directly state that Russia will be in control of, or at very least, have submissive allies in the territory of the northern Middle East. Syria, Persia, even controlling, eventually, Turkey, Togarmah. And that's our definition of the King of the North, isn't it? A foreign power that controls the territory to the north of Israel, centred around Syria, Persia, parts of Turkey. And so in that sense, we can see Russia perhaps as being the future King of the North, if not the current in that sense. It will need to make its grand move first. And the next events then describe the path of attack that Russia will take. We see that they'll go through the Promised Land. They'll attack the countries around, including Edom and Moab, Jordan today. And they'll also target Egypt. The land of Egypt will not escape. And again, we get that connection to Ezekiel 38 in verse 43. The Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. And we know both of these nations will be part of the Russian-led Gogian coalition. Let's just consider, for a moment, let's just take a moment to consider how we can argue that this may be coming into view now, or at least the groundwork for it might be being prepared. For all we know, things might be stopped from fully developing. It might be yet for a time appointed, as we've read throughout the chapter. Things might need to be pushed forward a bit. And that's all to do with God's mercy, giving us that chance, giving other people the chance to come to a knowledge of his kingdom. We know that we've had new members recently, Jacob, and he's joined at a time when Russia is obviously making a move. I remember I got baptised when Russia was also making its move in Ukraine in 2014. That was one of the things which inspired or encouraged me to do that. And so it is part of God's mercy why he's pushing things forward. But we could suggest that these things are being prepared right now for these events to happen. Russia right now, it's either in or has allies in many parts of the King of the North territory, doesn't it? In Iran, the regime's really pro-Russian. If you look at the countries which supported Russia in its invasion, it's really telling. I remember looking at the screen and they showed all the UN nations who either voted to condemn Russia, to be neutral or to support it. And you just had these very, very few countries supporting it, shining out in red. And two key of them was Iran and Syria. And then obviously you've got some random ones, typical countries like North Korea who will always vote for anything terrible. So it shows that they are building these allies in the north. I mean, just look at Syria. It's incredible what's going on in Syria. They have bases on the ground, control centres on the ground. I watched an incredible video. I would have put a picture of it if I had a bit more time. But you can see Putin and Assad visiting these sort of control centres in Russia where he's directing all the military events in Syria. And it's really incredible to see, a truly remarkable thing, right on the border with Israel. And Syria's almost become a sort of puppet state of the Russians at this point, largely because of its crucial support during the Civil War. And right now, we see Russia engaged in a brutal invasion of Ukraine, don't we? It's seeking to expand, it's seeking to re-establish itself as a world power. And notably, Turkey is involving itself, isn't it, in the conflict. It's become a place for negotiation between the two sides. And it's actually been quite a difficult situation with Russia over whether they should allow people through the Bosphorus. They have control over it. So there's some tricky situations between Turkey and Russia. Right now, in Syria as well, Turkey and Russia are in a very much conflict situation. They've sort of negotiated a thing for the time being, but they've come very close to war on a number of occasions. So there's a lot of trigger points between the two, which we could see. I suppose all of this depends on how we view Russia in the last days, the nature of the Gogian coalition, and to what extent it's a coalition, just a loose connection of nations, which it sort of already is. If we look, it already has a coalition of those countries. We just need to see it also having a coalition with parts of Europe as well. Or is it, as sort of John Thomas initially put forth, this idea of an image empire, which is actually a Russia which directly controls all these territories. It's sort of formally almost, not necessarily annexes, but has total control over them. They're not just in some loose coalition. So I think that's an interesting question for us to consider, because then, in that case, we'd need to see a big change, wouldn't we, in world affairs? We'd need to see Russia becoming a lot more powerful than it currently is. But all these things will come in time. And so we read then the final section of the chapter from verse 44. Tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Russia's come down to Egypt, it's taken the Middle East, it's passed through Jordan, it's passed through Israel. And these tidings trouble him. He shall go forth with great fury to destroy, to utterly make away many. And he'll plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas, in the glorious holy mountain, yet shall he come to his end, and none shall help him. And so Russia, after its victorious conquest, is suddenly disturbed. He hears these tidings out of the north and east. And north and east obviously being in the direction of Sinai. And we know that the saints, that Christ and the saints will come from Sinai, judgment taking place there, and then coming forth, subduing the territory immediately around Jordan, the territory east of Israel. And we know that partly, don't we, from passages like Isaiah 63. We read about him coming from Edom with dyed garments from Bozrah. We understand that the saints will make their move up from Sinai and will go around, take the same path as the children of Israel did when they were going to Israel in the first place. And so Russia hears that, the Gogian forces hear it, and considering themselves sort of now invincible, having taken control of so much, they rush forth into battle with them. They set up their tabernacle ready for war, something that people would do when they were going to war. But he will, we read, come to his end, and none shall help him. Just as we read about the king of fierce countenance in chapter 8, he was broken without hand, and so too Gog will be destroyed with an overwhelming force beyond any human army. None shall help him. Destroyed by Christ and his saints. And this point then marks the most profound change on Israel. We've seen throughout this chapter the many foreign rulers who reigned over Israel. They persecuted its people. They used it as a place to fight their battles, a battleground. But now at the end of the chapter we see the start of the true king of Israel's reign over the land. And Christ will reign over Israel. He'll bring it to its highest point, and he'll cause all the nations to come up towards Jerusalem. And that's the day we look forward to, isn't it, brothers and sisters? When the wicked reign of the world's current rulers will be destroyed, where there'll be no more nations fighting against each other, and there will only be Christ's reign above all. When the world finally acknowledges that truth, a truth we've seen throughout this chapter, that God controls all things and is the real ruler of this world.